Strange, but true stories. Tales from the light side, the dark side, and the other side. I'm Steve White. For most of us, a walk in the woods is relaxing. A nice way to get some fresh air and hear the birds and other forest creatures away from the sounds of the city. But for some, what they thought was going to be a pleasant jaunt into the woods turned out to be a terrifying encounter with an unknown creature from which they narrowly escaped. 1. The Fouke Monster. I'm a bit of a country boy, born and raised in the backwoods of Arkansas. I love the wilderness. I like the peacefulness of it, and it was always an escape for me. We lived on about 4 acres of land, which belonged to my grandfather before he passed away, and I frequently went on extended walks there. I never really encountered anything dangerous, although one time I nearly stepped on a copperhead, and so I never really carried any sort of protection with me other than a walking stick. The day that I encountered what I saw, I regretted not having something more substantial with me. It was 2008, and I was 14 years old. My dad came home one day after a long day at work. My mom worked in Little Rock and wasn't going to be home for a while. I could tell my dad was worn out, and I wanted to give him a little time to rest. So I told him I was going on a walk and to expect me back in about an hour or two. I gathered up some things like an energy bar, a flashlight, a bottle of water, and my trusty walking stick. After I got everything together, I made my way out into the woods. For the first little while, everything seemed fine. No disturbance or any sign of trouble. However, I was a bit surprised by the lack of noise. There was just dead silence. I didn't really think about it too much as I continued on, but it did strike me as a little strange. About 40 minutes into my trek, things started to get weird, to say the least. I began to hear the noise in the woods again, animals scurrying about in the leaves and the sound of twigs breaking, nothing really out of the ordinary. I arrived at a little creek, nothing deep, at the most 4 or 5 feet deep where the water pools. I decided to sit down and take a rest and take in the beauty of the area. I heard splashing in the creek. It didn't really register with me at first, but the splashing continued and it sounded like it was getting closer. The sun was going down below the horizon at this point, and it was getting a little dark. I was thinking, this could be a bear. From the splashing, I could tell it was something big, and without a second thought, I split. After a few minutes of running and feeling like I had gone far enough away from the creek, I stopped to catch my breath. I was terrified at this point. I was scared it was a bear or maybe even some creepy dude out in the woods. As it was getting darker now, I figured my best bet was to make my way back to the house, taking slow and quiet steps. I had been going for several minutes, and the moon was up now, and just a sliver of the sun was left on the horizon. I heard the leaves and twigs crunch again. I could tell that these noises were not being made by small rodents or even a deer. Instead, I could tell the creature taking these steps was big. Too big to be a person, more like a bear. My heart was pounding in my chest. I don't know about everyone else, but I was taught to yell at bears. This would often scare them away, so I stopped, turned in the direction the noise was coming, and let out a loud, "Get!" To any bear, this would scare them away, but the noise I heard was one of the most blood-curdling things I've ever heard. I can't really describe it very well, but I would say it sounded like a baby's cry and a woman screaming out in terror. When I heard that scream, I wanted to run. I tried to run, but my body wouldn't move. As I stood there motionless, I saw whatever this thing was stand up, and it started walking towards me. I was surprised to see that it looked human. Well, it looked human, but it wasn't. Its hair was brownish gray, with patches missing like it had the mange. I saw bloody spots where it appeared it had been scratching itself. It walked very slowly and looked kind of like an ape when it walked, with its arms hung low, but also with a similarity to a panther stalking its prey. Each footstep echoed in my head, and it wasn't long before it was looking down at me, showing its yellow fangs. It smelled awful. It was a cross between ammonia and rotting meat. It was so strong, it made my eyes water. I'm 5'10", and this thing was hunched over me. It was no less than 9 feet tall. After a moment, I finally overcame my fear and sprung into action. I took my walking stick and bashed it over the creature's head, breaking my stick in half. After that, I didn't waste a minute getting out of there. I ran so fast I turned what's normally a 20-minute walk into a 10-minute run. I made it back to the house. My dad had his rifle in his hands and was dressed to go out looking for me. He ran up to me and took me inside to sit on the couch. I looked at the clock. I had been gone nearly 3 hours. My dad asked me lots of questions about what happened, but I was still too scared to talk. After a few minutes, the police showed up. My dad had called them after having a conversation with my mom. After he assured them everything was all right and they left, he continued to ask me questions about what happened and where I had been. I couldn't talk about it. Eventually, I told him I saw something big and hairy, but that was all I could muster to tell him. It took me a while to recover. The next day, I went outside to sit on the back porch, and I couldn't believe what I saw laying there on the wood floor. It was the other half of the stick that had broken off over the creature's head. I had glazed my walking stick, and this had the same glaze as the lower half, and it fit perfectly when I put the two pieces back together. That definitely gave me chills. I certainly didn't go on any more walks while we lived there, and we moved out of that house a short time later. I'm nearly 25 now, and I live in Los Angeles. I still don't know what it was that I saw that night. From my research, I've concluded that it was the southern Sasquatch, or what the locals call the Fouke monster. I'm not entirely sure that's what it was, though. I've only told my wife about my encounter. If anybody else has had a similar encounter in the Arkansas woods, I would love to hear about it. 2. I'm still not sure what I saw. It was late spring in 2011, and I was in British Columbia. I was driving a rented old Ford Bronco around Cultus Lake late one night, or more accurately, early one morning, as it was about 2:30 a.m. Cultus Lake is in the southern part of British Columbia and about 100 kilometers east of Vancouver. I was coming around a sharp bend in the road right before you get up to the small farm community on the Canadian-U.S. border, and I noticed a deer in the middle of the road. My headlights weren't directly on it, but I could tell it was a deer down in the road. I stopped and thought to myself, the poor thing must have been hit by a car. I was just about to get back to the journey when I saw it. It was another animal with thick, dark brown or maybe black fur eating the deer. Whatever this creature was, it turned and looked at me square in the eyes. It had black eyes, with no sclera that I could tell, just the reflection of the truck lights staring at the high beams. I felt my blood pressure spike immediately, and my ears started to ring. This was fear. This was true fear like I had never experienced it before. And then the creature picked up the deer by its throat with its right hand or paw and stood up. It was holding a good-sized deer in one hand like it wasn't much at all. The creature was taller than my vehicle. I estimate it was at least 8 feet tall and maybe 500 pounds. That thing walked off into the woods on 2 legs, carrying the deer by the throat. Its legs bent at the knee like a human's, but it had this long stride and cleared the road in 2 steps. I slowly rolled the vehicle forward, dimmed the lights in the cab, and rolled down the window, which was not the smartest thing I've ever done. I managed to get within about 8 feet of the creature and got a really good look at its face. I remember those black eyes just staring at me. There was a distinct smell in the air. It was death. Yeah, it was like the smell of death. I'm not trying to be overly dramatic, but that rotten flesh smell was very prevalent. Then, it made a sound I will never forget. A deep vocal warning, low and loud. I hit the accelerator and got out of there as fast as I could. As good a look as I got of it, I'm still reluctant to say exactly what I saw. I call the creature it, but it could have been a Bigfoot or even a dog man that I've heard others mention. I mentioned this story to my girlfriend who was from Vancouver, but she just thought I had seen a bear. My grandmother, however, grew up in a different part of Canada where the belief of the supernatural and cryptids is still pretty mainstream, and she believed the story along with other members of my family. 3. It was no bear. I was a teenager in high school growing up in West Virginia back in the late 90s. I spent a lot of time in the woods, and in wild, wonderful West Virginia, there's lots of woods to get lost in and have an adventure. I'm 35 now, but this is a story that I will never forget for as long as I live. I lived in Greenbrier County at the time. To tell you the truth, there's not much to do but hunt and fish. When we weren't hunting, we were out scouting or digging ginseng or ramps, which is a very potent wild onion that grows in Appalachia, or looking for mushrooms. We trout fished in the mountains all of the time. It was the summer of 1998. My brother Alex, our friend Tom, and I were out fishing for native trout. They are a relatively small trout compared to the huge browns and rainbows in the rivers in the Greenbrier Valley. But man, are they good and tasty to eat. We were fishing an area known as Little Clear Creek. This area is very rugged and not easy to get to. You have to travel old mine roads to the back country, which is completely void of any humanity. It's a trip that we had taken countless times before, but on this particular day, our perception of all that we knew that was real would quickly evaporate. We had been fishing for the entire day without much luck when we came to a deep hole in the creek. Tom and I were both exhausted, but my little brother wanted to keep going because he never got tired of fishing. Tom and I decided to just wade into the water, sit down, and cool ourselves off. Alex was standing on the bank, tying a new lure onto his line. Tom and I sat in the water and were talking when we heard what sounded like a bulldozer crashing through the woods. That's the only way that I can figure how to describe it. Whatever it was making as much noise as possible as it came crashing through the trees. We all looked at each other, confused. This was definitely not a deer. There are a lot of big black bears in the area, but we hardly ever saw any, and they are rarely confrontational. As we are all looking around at each other, trying to figure out what is making this racket, a rock about the size of a briefcase lands in the water right between me and Tom. Now, the noise that we had heard leading up to this had come from the opposite side of the bank from where my brother was standing. Alex looked up to see what could have thrown the rock, and that's when we heard the loudest growl, or scream, or god-awful roar I have ever heard. It's hard to explain the noise. It was terrifying, gut-wrenching, and absolutely evil. There was a high wall on the side of the bank the roar came from. A few moments later, a tree began to shake violently. At this point, Tom and I could not see what was shaking the tree because of the high wall. We turned to look at Alex, and he was stone stiff. Whatever he was looking at was terrifying him. We got out of the water quickly, and as we got to the bank, we turned to see just what had frozen my brother. What we saw was not a bear. It was solid black, but it was enormous. We estimated it to be about 7 feet tall, but it could have been bigger. We could see it very well, and it had a face that looked like it had been smacked with a shovel. The nose was flat, a large forehead that topped into a cone, and a huge lower jaw. The eyes? The eyes were as hollow and black as space. The lips were peeled back, exposing its teeth. The only animal the face could compare to that we knew about would be a gorilla. It had very long arms, which it stretched out when we made eye contact. We stood there for a few moments, too stunned to move and trying to make sense out of what we were seeing. It then went down on all fours and lunged to a sliding stop. It began tearing at the earth. It was ripping huge chunks of ground and throwing it in all directions. It clawed, screamed, and tore up the area around it. This thing was pissed. It tore at the trees and screamed. At that point, we dropped everything and got the heck out of there. As we ran, we heard an enormous splash, and it sounded like it was continuing to thrash around in the water. We never looked back. We left all of our tackle and rods there and never returned to get them. When we got back home, we decided to never tell anybody what we had seen. It would be our secret because we figured no one would believe us and just think we were weird or making something up. But it's the God's honest truth. The reality of what's real and what's not has never been the same to us. 4. I heard the howl. I was 17, living in northwest Alabama at the time of my first encounter. I was bored one day and decided to walk in the woods, where some of us local guys would often go and explore or just hang out to pass the time. Usually there were 3 or 4 of us that would go, but this day it was just me. Just a short distance into the woods was a small clearing where we would just hang out. I sat down and had only been there a few minutes when I began to get the creepiest feeling that something was watching me. It felt like something bad was just about to happen. I didn't see or hear anything, but the feeling just kept getting more intense. I stuck around for a few more minutes, but I couldn't take it anymore, so I left to return to the house. Just before I got back to where I lived, I ran into a couple of my friends and told them about the weird feeling I had while in the woods. And so we decided that since there were 3 of us now, 3 invulnerable teenagers, we'd go and check it out. We got back to the woods and we each picked up a stick. We went down a trail that we often used. We were in there maybe an hour, and after not finding anything, we decided to leave. I still felt uneasy, but it wasn't as bad with other people being there. Myself and one of the guys walked out of the woods while the other guy lagged behind a bit. I'm not sure why or what caused him to lag behind, but we got maybe 50 yards in front of him. And then we heard footsteps. The guy we had left behind was sprinting to where we were with a frightened look on his face. We asked him what was wrong, and he said after he had walked out of the woods, he got about 30 feet or so and turned around to look back into the woods. And standing at the opening where we exited, there was a large creature standing on 2 legs, just watching him. He described it as having either black or possibly very dark brown hair. Its face had no hair on it, and it was lighter in color than the rest of it. It had round, yellow eyes. We all then looked toward the woods, but didn't see anything there. So we headed back home quickly. A couple of days later, we decided to go back and take another look around. I know, it was a dumb idea, going unarmed into the woods after what my friend described seeing. But we were incredibly curious. So we went back into the woods, but we didn't see or hear anything. And after a couple of hours or so, we wound up at the clearing where I had that spooky feeling a few days prior. We sat down to rest and talk, and had been there for about 5 minutes when we heard the loudest, scariest sounding yell that you could imagine. Not only could you hear it, but you could feel this yell. There's a clip I've heard called the Ohio Howl. That's the sound we heard. Only, imagine that Ohio howl being blasted from a 1,000-watt stereo setup a few feet from you, and then you would be getting close to what it sounded like to us. As you can imagine, we got the heck out of there quick, fast, and in a hurry. We didn't go back for 3 weeks or more. By that time, I had borrowed a 12-gauge shotgun from my brother-in-law. Also, as luck would have it, late one night on one of the cable channels, they ran the film Sasquatch, Legend of Bigfoot. I'd seen that before, and remembered that it had the Sasquatch scream at the beginning of the movie. And since we didn't have a VCR at the time, when the movie was on, I recorded that scream on a cassette recorder. I wasn't familiar with what's known now as call blasting, but I had the idea that since it was so similar to what we'd heard, that I'd take a portable tape player and play that yell in the woods, and see if we could get a response. It wasn't extremely loud, but turned all the way up, it echoed through the woods pretty well. I tried it several times, but got no response. We kept going until we got to a point where the creek ran into the river that ran through the woods. I decided to try it again at this spot. I played it once, nothing. I rewound it, did it again. There was a reply from upstream. I rewound the tape again and played it. And once again, there was a reply from upstream. While I was rewinding the tape to play it again, there was a yell from downstream. Then the one upstream replied to the one downstream, and they did that a couple more times. We could tell they were getting closer and were probably going to wind up meeting at the place where we were. I only had 3 shells for the shotgun, and since there were clearly at least 2 creatures, we decided to take off before they got there. After we got back home, this time we told our parents about what was happening. Thankfully, my dad and one of the other boys' dad believed us enough that they agreed to go down to the woods with us to check it out. So we went back into the woods, and we're walking close to the bank of the river, and we're going down this trail. I'm the last one in line as we're walking. I hear something break what sounds like a pretty large limb behind us, and I say something to my dad about it. So we all turn around and start heading back down the trail. After about 100 yards or so, we come upon a sandy area of the riverbank that we had walked across just a little bit earlier. There, alongside all of our footprints, were 2 footprints that were 17.5 inches long and 7.5 inches wide across the ball of the foot. There was a distance of about 48 inches from the heel of the first foot to the toes of the last foot. It had 5 toes, and the prints were obviously made by something much heavier than any of us, because they were noticeably deeper than our prints. One thing of note is that these prints weren't just packed down like if someone with fake feet had made them, but you could clearly see where the toes had kicked loose dirt back onto the packed down dirt, and the creature's toes flexed as it stepped forward. We didn't see the creature that day, but did find some otherwise healthy pine trees about 5 inches in diameter snapped over about 5 feet up from the ground. There was what appeared to be several strands of black hair about an inch long in the bark near the break. That was it for us for the day. A few weeks later, I actually saw the creature. Me, my 2 friends, and my brother-in-law went back into the woods. For whatever reason, we had split up and were looking on our own. Looking back on it now, you couldn't pay me enough to go into those woods alone, even armed. Anyway, as I walked into the edge of the clearing, I stopped to just look around. And that's when I saw it. It stepped out from the trees on the other side of the clearing. The clearing wasn't large, and so it was maybe 25 yards between me and this creature. It was a clear day. The sun was shining, and I had a perfect, unobstructed view of this thing. Judging by a tree branch that it was standing under, which was slightly over its head, This thing was almost 8 feet tall. It was covered in dark brown hair with what appeared to be a bit of reddish tinge to it. There was no hair on its face, and its face was kind of a muddy color. The face was not really ape-like, nor was it canine exactly, but it appeared to have more of a snout than a human or ape-like nose. The eyes were yellowish in color. The arms were longer proportionally than a human's arms, and it just stopped and looked at me. It didn't seem alarmed at my presence, and it didn't seem agitated or anything like that. So I just stood there, and it stared at me. I was frozen, not knowing exactly what I should do. We stared at each other for probably 20 seconds or so. It was plenty of time to be sure it wasn't imagination, a person in a suit, a bear, or anything else. Then it turned and walked back into the woods, and just as it disappeared back into the trees, it made that terrifying yell again. Although I didn't see it making the sound, it had to be what was doing it, as it came from where it just went. So from that, I know the sound of the Ohio howl is at least one of the yells or screams, or whatever you want to call it, that a Sasquatch makes. When I had my sighting, I had a .22 caliber pistol with me, but instantly knew better than to try and shoot it with that small of a gun. It would have been suicide. I quickly turned around and left to go and find my friends. I found them and told them what had happened. They wanted to go to the spot I had seen it, but honestly, I had had enough and just wanted to get the heck out of there. 5. It was supernatural. My wife and I always referred to our encounter as the event when we discussed it in private. Our children don't have a clue what had taken place in our lives when we were so young and first dating. Our event took place during the late fall of 1978 in the Maryland countryside. The county had just built a new park that had a few baseball fields, a playground, and tennis courts surrounded by woods, a nice creek, and a whole lot of Maryland farmland around it. On Friday and Saturday nights, the new park became a very popular spot for high school kids to go and park, or just hang out and party in the small pavilion there when the weather was mild. It quickly became a favorite of ours that we would go hang out and park. The evening of our encounter was a cold one, and we had the car running, heat on, and Frampton Comes Alive playing on my 8-track. I had just backed my car, a recently purchased 1969 Nova SS, into the closest parking spot near the woods, so no one could see us from the main road. We were the only car in the lot that night, I think because it was pretty cold out. We hadn't been there very long, maybe 15, 20 minutes. We were talking and laughing when a number of deer came running at a fast pace behind our car. It sounded like they were making huffing sounds. I'm not sure if it was the deer or what was chasing them that was making that noise. These deer were really moving, and I'd never seen deer run like that before. We'd always seen them in the fields, just grazing and maybe looking up when a car pulled into the lot. But they would usually go back to doing what they were doing before. About 45 seconds later, there was a small thud on the trunk of the car. I said to my girlfriend, it's probably just one of the deer running by, and it had a glancing bump on the back of the car. Almost immediately after I said that, there was a big thud. It actually moved the car up and down one time. Now, the weekend before this, when we had gone to a friend's party and had pulled up on the curb where the party was being held, a few of my football buddies ran up and started pushing down on the trunk to make the car wobble up and down. I jumped out and chased them. It was all in good fun, and we were all laughing about it. Just a stupid high school thing. So immediately, I thought my buddies had spotted us from the road somehow, snuck up on us, and were messing with us again. I jumped out to chase them. This time, I grabbed my long police flashlight to run them into the woods. I jumped out, but stopped immediately. I was looking into the face of something that doesn't exist. At least in my wildest dreams, I didn't think something like that could exist outside of myth or legend. My girlfriend spotted the same thing I was looking at out the back window of the car and began screaming. It was just enormous, ugly, and it was obviously not happy. I'm pretty sure it was already growling when I opened my car door and jumped out. It was a low growl, but it was a growl I've never forgotten. It was quiet, but it rumbled my chest like a bass guitar would at a 70s rock concert. It was very strange that it was such a low volume, but I could still feel it intensely in my body. It was dark out, but the car's interior light popped on when I opened the door. I hadn't turned the flashlight on yet, which I'm very thankful for now. What I saw was more than enough with the available light. It was only about 5 or 6 feet away from me, and it had saliva dripping from its mouth. Its eyes looked reddish, maybe a dark orange, and they appeared to be glowing. I've never been sure if it was a reflection or if they were self-illuminating. At the time, I was 6'3" and weighed 225 pounds. This creature had to be at least 9 feet tall, if not taller, and had to weigh well over 400 pounds. I felt very small all of a sudden. The thing was incredibly bulky, massive and intimidating in a way I'd never known before or since. It's also amazing how fast your mind moves at a moment like that, taking in all you saw in just a few seconds. The entire encounter outside the car was only a few seconds long. As it was standing behind the trunk of the car, it all of a sudden kind of glided or slid about a foot closer towards me. How it moved was not natural at all. It was like it was standing on a conveyor belt in the grass as it moved towards me. That's the only way I can describe it. Like it slid over the grass without moving. That's one of the reasons I thought it was surely supernatural. As it made that move, I saw it quickly glance down at the long flashlight I was still holding, and then right back up at me. I moved like I'd never moved before in my life, and I was very thankful that the car had been running. To this very day, I'm not sure how, but I found myself back in the driver's seat, my door closing as I took the Nova SS out of that parking lot, across a grass barrier, and onto the main road. My girlfriend was still screaming, and I was yelling at her, "What the hell was that? What the hell was that?" at the top of my lungs over and over again. Another thing is, just as I put the car in gear and was moving forward, there was a loud thump in the back of the car. I never knew if it was the creature trying to grab or hit it, or something it possibly threw as I flew out of there. It left a dent on the right side of the rear panel that wasn't there before that night. The one thing I haven't shared yet is that as it moved towards me, glanced down at my flashlight and back up at me, I saw another set of eyes a few feet behind it. I think that's when I moved into action. It was hazy to me that night, and it's still unclear to me what made me react so quickly. I can only reason its movement forward, glance down, and back up, and the new set of eyeballs spurred me. It's amazing how fast your mind works at a moment like that. Even the way I reacted seemed to me afterwards unnaturally quick. Or maybe it was just a case that I had no recollection because of the intensity of the moment. I don't recall seeing a body with the second set of eyes. We were scared for a long time afterwards. We didn't even discuss it for about a month. I can tell you that it was definitely instrumental in bringing us into the church. We felt it was demonic, and we placed our lives as close to God as we could get. I don't think it was a Sasquatch by the descriptions I've heard. I'm not even sure if it's the dogman creature some people talk about. It looked more like an oversized black wolf to us, and it seemed to be pure evil. I'm not sure if these things were chasing the deer, or the deer felt their presence and fled. It seems to me if they wanted the deer, they would have just continued on their way and not stopped to bother us in our car. Scripture declares that what evil means for bad, God works out for good. It surely drove us into the arms of the Lord. As the years went by, my wife no longer wanted to talk about it. I surely needed to still process and try to work out what we saw and felt that night. It's strange how two people can go through the same exact event and feel differently about how to deal with it in the end. That's completely understandable. I've moved back to that area now to take care of an aging parent. I've thought about going over to that park a few times. I even had to drive by it one day to pick something up for my mother. I glanced over, but still couldn't pull in. After all these years, I can still feel some of the terror of that night. If nothing else, life can be very, very interesting. 6. The skunk ape in Texas. I was living in Brownwood, Texas back in 1974. My sister and I loved to take walks to the store and back through the woods when we were younger. There was this shortcut we would take. We always took our German Shepherd along with us too. One day, on our way back home, we crossed the creek as we always did. My sister paused and asked, "Do you smell that?" I told her I did. How could you not? It was awful. Like a skunky smell, but worse, like really rotten garbage. We kept moving, trying to get that smell out of our noses. Now, our German Shepherd had a lot of energy and always ran ahead of us. We were getting to the edge of the woods when I saw what I thought was a big furry blanket blowing from behind the tree, almost like when there's a sheet on the clothesline with the wind blowing. I didn't really think it could be anything, but as our dog ran by what I thought was the furry blanket, this creature stepped out from behind the tree, reaching for her. She let out a yipping sound, and my sister and I dropped everything and screamed. There was another, longer route home, and we took off running and crying and screaming. We both were running as fast as we could. We kept falling down and getting back up, but we didn't dare look behind us. I didn't want this creature to catch me, but I sure as heck didn't want to know if it was chasing me and my sister or not. We didn't see where our dog went because we took off in the other direction. When we got home, we ran in and told my mom what we saw, and she called Dad and told him. Our German Shepherd was nowhere to be found. When my dad got home a few minutes later, we told him the full story again, about what we had smelled and seen. He knew exactly what it was. He said what we saw was called a skunk ape. He headed out the door and into the woods to search for our dog. After going out and looking, he couldn't find anything but our bags that we had left behind. It had been about an hour since our encounter, and our dog was still missing at this point. We just hoped that she had gotten scared and been able to run off and hide somewhere. About 2 hours later, we finally found our dog. She was still shaking pretty bad, but wasn't hurt at all. After that experience, I wouldn't sleep alone in my room for the longest time. It was years before I could fall asleep with nobody in the same room with me because I was so afraid that Bigfoot or the skunk ape would get me. This has been another strange but true stories. Have you ever encountered anything in the woods where you live that is beyond the scope of normal? Maybe you know that you came into contact with Bigfoot and haven't told anyone for fear they would make fun of you. Share it with us. Send us an email to strangebutTrueStories2@gmail.com. Tell us what you thought of these stories in the comments section below. Subscribe if you haven't already. And if you would like to be notified when a new video drops on our channel, you can set up notifications by clicking the bell in the top right next to your icon. Thanks for taking the time today to watch our video. I'm Steve White. Until next time.